Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. Today we're going to be looking at the subject of we reproduce what we are. Now, we actually addressed that in episode 35, where we looked at the law of reproduction. David was in distress. He was fleeing from King Saul. He's hiding in a cave. A bunch of people who had the same problems came to him because you also attract what you are. But then David also reproduced what he was, and that was by the end of his life, he had this incredible group of mighty warriors, but they didn't start there. They became giant killers because David reproduced because he was a giant killer. Now, the positive of that law we see in David's life, but unfortunately, that law also works in the negative context because what we see is David unfortunately pass along and reproduce some of the same character flaws that he had that hurt him. We now see them creeping up inside of his family. And so we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 13, and it's a really sad story that kicks off more sad stories. But I really need to get to the root of what happened, and that is the law of reproduction. But I want to share a couple scriptures that might help us in the light of a lot of things culturally that we're dealing with, things that people are talking about or pushing and advocating. And so we always need to go back to the Bible and let Bible be the filter and matrix by which we build our beliefs, our worldview, our political view, our business view. It all comes back to the Bible. Now, Exodus chapter 20, verse 5 says, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third, to the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments." Now, if you look at this passage of Scripture at just face value, will take it and go, because my great-great-great-grandfather did such and such crime, I need to somehow pay or be punished or penalized for crimes that were committed that I wasn't a part of, and I never even met the person who did it and didn't meet the people who they did it to. And they'll use this passage of Scripture to go, look, see, that's what God expects. He expects vindication and judgment upon generation after generation. And that's out of context because the principles of hermeneutics, which is the science of biblical interpretation, is Scripture always interprets Scriptures. Scripture can't contradict one another, and you can't divorce one part of Scripture to justify another part. So it's Scripture that gives clarity to Scripture because there's two other passages of Scripture that we have to use as the filter for Exodus chapter 20, and that is Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 16. "Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin." Here we see in Deuteronomy, God does not expect the kids or the grandkids or the great-grandkids to be punished for the sins that they weren't responsible for. Why? Because that's not justice. Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20. Jesus said, "In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let everything be established." So if there's a true principle, you will always find more than one scripture to validate and back up that truth. So Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20. "The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself." If God judges us for the sins of grandparents we never met, we would really be in a great predicament because we'd never be able to get out from under the judgment from the accumulation of my dad's sins, his dad's sins, his dad's dad's sins, And there's 1,000 generations on average in an average family going back all the way to the beginning of Adam and Eve. So that's 1,000 grandparents that you would be under the weight of their judgment. Now, I like what a Jewish theologian, Dennis Prager, what he said, and this is out of his commentary on the book of Exodus. This is what he writes regarding these passages of Scripture. First, the Torah always establishes God as just. Second, if this is really what God meant to say, God punishes 4 generations of offsprings for the sins of their ancestors, it would not only be unjust, but it would be utterly counterproductive. It would be announcing that no matter how good a person you become, no matter how different a person you are from your God-hating father or grandfather, you will still be punished, and that alone would make someone hate God. I agree with Dennis Prager in his interpretation of that. So, what do we do with Exodus chapter 20, verse 5? In light of Scripture interpreting Scripture, here is the best explanation of that. When we sin as parents, it impacts our kids and it impacts their kids. Sin impacts. It's impossible to put a rock in the middle of a pond and drop it in there and not see the ripples. And what God is telling us is, look, when we sin, it's going to hurt our kids. It's going to hurt our grandkids. The impact of that is going to be possibly felt for generations to come. Sin creates repercussions that brings pain. Also, what psychologists will often talk about is the cycles of sins. And I also think this is really what God is talking about, and that is you'll see cycles of sins often in families. You'll often see a family that has a pattern of gambling addiction, and it just kind of carries on down. You'll see alcoholism that just tends to run inside of families. In fact, people who have family members or parents that are alcoholics, anybody in AA is going to say, whatever you do, don't start to drink, because your chances are greater that it's going to become an addiction for you, just simply because of the genetics that are being passed along. So we see 2 things. There's the consequences that impacts our kids. If I get into a car and my kids are in the car and I break rules and laws and speed recklessly and hit a telephone pole, my kids feel that same impact and the consequences. It wasn't their choice. Unfortunately, they suffer because of it. Now, what we need to look at this is, look, mom and dad, we can ask God's forgiveness and he forgives us. But when we understand the ramifications that our sin brings, not just to ourselves, but to our kids and our grandkids, then it makes us stop to go, is it worth it? Is this decision I'm about to make, the sin that's tempting me and enticing me, when I look at all the people in the wake of this decision that might get hurt, is it worth it? It helps bring clarity, because a lot of people go, well, it's not hurting anybody. Well, no, sin hurts, not just you. It's going to hurt a whole lot of people around you. And this is the story that we pick up with. What we see is David had a battle with lust. He failed in that battle of lust, and he's forgiven. And God does incredible things through even Bathsheba, and there's a Solomon, and Jesus comes through the lineage. We talked about it. We serve an incredibly redeeming God. Unfortunately, the cycle of sin impacts his kids. And so we see his son Solomon have some serious battles inside of this area. We see in this next story his son named Amnon, who also battled this and unfortunately failed the battle, and it brings a lot of heartache into David. And so that's the story we're going to pick up with next week, and we're going to get some very important leadership principles and just some important life principles on how to live victoriously over temptation. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.